evening and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. I'm Rebecca Munro and this is Scotland at 7. And tonight I am joined with Peter Curran. Peter, how are you this evening?
I'm well, Rebecca. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. So we'll start off with the daily coronavirus update and then we'll get into the top stories of the questions later on. So, as of 2 p.m. today, a total of 2,993,116 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and the UK Government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 2,480,804 have been confirmed negative, 512,312 have tested positive. There are 3,375 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. Due to IT issues, the figures reported today are likely to be an underestimate of the total tests and cases. There are 21 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 8,263. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 1,064 were in hospital last night, 89 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 4,144,904 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,788,551 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show 134,446 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 185 since yesterday. And this number refers to deaths in all settings, not just hospitals. On to the ONS update. In the week ending the 3rd of September 2021, the estimated percentage of the community population that had COVID-19 was 1.38% in England, 1.54% in Wales, 1.74% in Northern Ireland, and 2.23% in Scotland. An estimated 1.5% of the UK population were experiencing self-reported long COVID at the 1st of August 2021. There were 781 deaths involving coronavirus registered in the week ending the 3rd of September 2021, accounting for 7.6% of all deaths in the UK. This is an increase from 769 deaths in the week before. The latest week included the summer bank holiday, so differences between this week and the previous week should be treated with caution. Deaths involving COVID-19 are consistently lower for people who have received 2 vaccinations. So our first story of this evening is vaccinations for 12 to 15-year-olds to start from next Monday and general school safety. Children and young people aged 12 to 15 years old will be offered a dose of the coronavirus vaccination from Monday the 20th of September after Scottish ministers accepted advice from the 4 UK chief medical officers. As a result, a dose of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine will be offered to all children and young people aged 12 to 15 who are not already covered by existing advice from the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, in a move to reduce the disruption caused to education by COVID-19. This group will be offered their injection in drop-in clinics in the community settings, followed by each young person receiving a letter inviting them to attend a community clinic. For some rural health boards, those aged 12 to 15 will be first offered the vaccine at school. Following the initial phase, vaccines will be offered to both communities and schools so that anyone who hasn't been vaccinated but would like to has the opportunity to take up the offer. Meanwhile, people who receive their vaccination during phase 1 of the national COVID-19 vaccination programme in Scotland will start to receive booster injections from the 20th of September. In her statement today, the First Minister also announced that safety mitigations to keep children, young people and staff safe in schools will be extended until at least the October holidays. Education Secretary Shirley-Ann Somerville later confirmed that all current mitigations, including the use of face coverings by pupils in secondary school classrooms, will still be required to help keep schools as safe as possible. In addition, updated guidance will be provided in the information letters that schools are asked to send to staff and the parents of primary and secondary pupils when they are in low-risk contact with positive cases in schools. These will now include a strengthened recommendation to take a lateral flow test before returning to school. This is in addition to current advice for staff and secondary pupils to take lateral flow test twice a week, with a few days apart, and record the result before returning to the classroom. There will be a continued requirement for staff to keep at least a 1 metre distance from each other and from children and young people when they are at schools. Revised guidance to reflect these changes will be published as soon as possible. So, Peter, firstly, let's just briefly talk about the vaccinations for 12 to 15-year-olds. So, do you agree with the JCVI that the benefits of vaccinating 12 to 15-year-olds outweigh the risks?
Yes, I do agree with that. But I have points to make on risk, unless you want to shift the topic in another direction.
No, not at all.
Okay, well, I've been trying to get a hashtag going recently. I've never had any success in creating a hashtag that acquired any mojo of its own. But it was the essence of the argument, which the unpronounceable acronym TOTA. I feel in so many things we have to boil down the complexity of the debate to the essence of the argument. And the essence of the argument, or some of them, on this, the whole question of vaccination is the question of voluntarism. And what should a modern society do in the face of a major threat which demands vaccination in relation to voluntarism? It's a very, very difficult one. I mean, it mirrors the question that happens in wartime, where clearly governments just ride roughshod, in a sense, over civil rights. But there's another topic behind that, which is fundamental and has been fundamental in research for the last 30 years. And that is, how do people make decisions that involve risk? Whether they're Wall Street traders or politicians or generals in uncertain situations, or the ordinary man in the street. And well, it'd be arrogant of me to try and boil down such complex and deep-ranging research into one essence. It comes down to this: who is making the decision? People will often accept reluctantly quite draconian decisions, because either they feel they're right and they realise they're giving up some rights, but they feel it's the appropriate thing to do, or because they feel they have no choice in the matter and they can abdicate responsibility. It's rather like the position of many people in relation to politics. They say, I don't do politics. I don't get involved with all of that nasty stuff. And my response to them is, well, you may not do politics, but politics will do you. People actually don't like to be personally involved as the sole decider on things that involve risk and could involve a negative outcome. Now, this has been shown again and again when people are asked to make a bet. And in one bet, they have an absolute certainty of something happening. But there's another bet where there isn't absolute certainty, but the reward is infinitely greater. And perhaps the logic is to take that bet. People don't want to be associated with a decision which rebounds. And for many years, I was a victim of that myself in the flu jab. I realised the flu jab made sense. I'd had severe flu, life-threatening flu. I'd been hospitalised twice in my life for severe flu. But I didn't want to make the decision because I knew there were potential side effects. And I was not weighing rationally the risk effects balance between them, which is the essence of all risk analysis. Now, this is the problem with this at the moment. And in the 12 to 15-year-olds, it's compounded by the fact that the parents have a two-layered decision. One, do they think it's the right thing for their child to have the vaccination? And secondly, do they think it's the right thing or the wrong thing for them to impose the decision on the child? And is it the right thing to allow a child of 12 to 15, and legally they're still a child, to make that decision for themselves? So it's very, very complex. I don't know really where we go on this. I mean, there was, way back in the last century, a woman in America called Typhoid Mary, which was a most unfortunate appellation to be stuck in anybody. But she was a carrier of the lethal disease typhoid. And she caused the deaths of countless thousands of people. And eventually she was taken into a kind of custody. The state simply removed her rights, every legal right she had, and took her into custody. And then she was released again at a much later point and went on to repeat the thing. How does society deal with that? Where does the freedom of the individual begin and end? Because there is no such thing, if you want to be a member of a society, of complete and total freedom. I mean, the old medieval Britain had the concept of the outlaw. that you could reject all the norms of society, in which case you stood completely outside society, and you were fair game for anybody. So it's a very difficult decision. It's a decision I'm remotely involved on as a grandparent and a great-grandparent and a parent within my own extended family. It's a very difficult one to make. People really need careful counselling on just what a risk balance means. That, to me, is the most important thing. I have no doubt it's the right thing to do. Would I impose it on someone I loved when they were saying?
Yeah, true. Well, we'll move on to our next story of this evening, and that is the question on the Scottish Parliament designation. The Scottish Greens have said that the right to protest remains fundamental. Asking an urgent question in Parliament this afternoon, Ms Mackay highlighted that designating the Scottish Parliament in line with the Serious Organised Crime and Policy Act 2005 would criminalise forms of peaceful protest. Gillian Mackay pointed out the significant concern around the change in status of the Scottish Parliament estate from the 1st of October, which will criminalise forms of peaceful protest, and expressed concern that statements from the SBCB have failed to recognise this. Ms Mackay said, "I know many MSPs have joined protests outside this Parliament, as have I, for a whole range of issues. Protest is a fundamental part of our democracy. The Scottish Parliament should be open, accessible and welcoming of peaceful protest." The Green MSP also voiced concerns about how this process has been conducted and observed. The minutes of the SPCB's meeting on the 24th of June note that the SPCB discussed the matter and highlight that concerns were raised by Maggie Chapman, MSP. The minutes make no mention of consulting MSPs nor the public. In fact, MSPs were not even informed of change until legislation had already been laid in the Commons. The controversy around this matter should have been avoided if the SPCB had adopted a more transparent approach, in line with the Scottish Government's key principles of accountability and open participation, said Ms Mackay. So, Peter, what effect do you think designation will have on people being able to protest peacefully outside the Scottish Parliament? Oh, Peter, are you there? Okay, I think we have lost connection with Peter, so we will move on to the next story and hopefully he will join us later on. So our next story is health and social care. In a Scottish Parliament debate today, the Scottish Government won approval for their policy on recovering, remobilising and renewing health and social care in Scotland. The Parliament approved a motion thanking Scotland's NHS and social care staff for their heroic efforts during the COVID-19 pandemic, and recognises that the pandemic has been the biggest shock that the NHS and social care services have ever faced. Parliament welcomed the £1 billion NHS recovery plan, which will significantly increase inpatient, outpatient and diagnostic capacity. This increase includes recruiting an additional 1,500 staff to work in the new network of national treatment centres. The plan puts particular focus on early cancer diagnostics and referral pathways, as well as child and adult mental health services, and emphasises mental health and well-being of health and social care. Staff must be a key priority and central focus in the future. The Scottish Government has committed to creating a national care service which will have ethical commissioning and setting terms and conditions that meet the Fair Work principles at the core to greatly improve how social care is delivered. The motion agreed that the voices of lived experience, including those who access support and care, and the workforce and unpaid carers, must be central to the ongoing consultation on the service. Peter, are you back with us now?
Yes, I am. I don't know what happened there. The screen just froze.
Yeah, I think there was a wee bit of a loss of connection there. Well, we had a question on the Scottish Parliament about the protests that have been happening. It was one of our stories. And I was just wondering, Peter, about the designation on the Scottish Parliament, the peaceful protest designation on the Scottish Parliament.
Yeah, and so, I understand the issue, and I would like to comment on that.
Yes, no, of course. I was just wondering what your opinion was on that story.
Well, as Linda knows, my initial opinion was instinctively, I don't like this. All of my years of viewing of American law and order said, resist this, this is an infringement on our rights, and we shouldn't do it. The other side of me kept coming into my mind the tragedy of Joe Cox. the MP that was murdered. I know she was murdered tragically in the streets in a random attack, but at the end of the day, our elected representatives are vulnerable, perhaps certainly more than they've ever been in my lifetime, in my observations of politics. So the question is, where does tolerance stop outside the Parliament? What's the perimeter? Who is threatened by this? Whose interests are being served? I don't find it easy to make a decision on it. And I have an additional concern, which is when you give politicians and the police, and at the end of the day, this has been given by politicians to the police, a right. They may say, oh yes, but we will only exercise these extreme penalties in extreme situations. They're very reluctant to let go of a power once they've got it. But to use an old Glasgow phrase, which I'm fond of because it seems the only one that encapsulates the behaviour of certain people, we cannot allow bampoids to range about the precincts of the Parliament and make life difficult, not only for the politicians, but for the people themselves and perhaps even for people that are there on valid process. We can't allow protests to impede the essential procedures of government. It's a very difficult line to find. I understand why they've done it. I myself, in attending at demonstrations at the Parliament, being outside the Parliament in marches, being inside the Parliament at FMQs, realised the vulnerabilities and the dangers in the system. And in a very much less significant way, I've been responsible, a wider responsibility for security in large, dangerous factories, and had to deal with strikes and pickets at strike. So I have some concept of that. On balance, I have to say I support the legislation, but it has to be examined and monitored very, very, very carefully. And it may result in the ultimate irony of there being an illegal demonstration outside the Parliament against the right of people to hold demonstrations outside the Parliament. So that for me is the essence of the argument. Like all big questions, it's not an easy one just to jump down on. It's a bad thing or it's a good thing, a black and white judgment, Rebecca.
So do you think that there should have been maybe slightly more debate about this before it was approved by the Scottish Parliament corporate body?
Well, I don't know what debate there was, but certainly there was no debate about I regard myself as reasonably well informed. I can have tunnel vision on certain issues and I miss things that everybody else knows about. So surely you knew about that and I didn't. But it just seemed to come out of nowhere. I mean, it jolted me out of my seat when I saw the headlines. Oh my God, I spoke to Linda and she said, well, we'll take a nuanced approach in this, be careful where you jump in. But it's one to be closely watched.
Yeah, and we also read out briefly the health and social care story in which the Scottish Parliament debated today, and the Scottish Government won approval for their policy on recovering, remobilising and renewing health and social care in Scotland. So Humza Yousaf also noted that the £1 billion recovery plan will increase NHS inpatient and outpatient capacity and recruit an additional 1,500 staff to work in national treatment centres. And we can only hope that this cash injection will help the beleaguered NHS. So what are your thoughts on this as well, Peter?
Well, on this and many similar issues on Broadcasting Scotland previously, what can I say? I mean, I'm not as well informed, and no layperson is, as the people who make these decisions. And I have to not defer, but recognise, old Dr. Johnson, the old man who wrote the dictionary, had a saying to people when he got impatient with them. He would say, I, sir, have studied this matter, you have not. And I realise many people have studied this in depth. So like any allocation of funding and the direction of funding and the nature of budgeting, anybody can ask for more, usually the Labour Party or the Tory Party, with no conception of where the more is coming from or what other choices will have to be made. I welcome anything that's more money for the kind of causes that matter fundamentally to us. And billions and millions sound like big money. In certain contexts, they may be a drop in the ocean against what these worthy causes really need. But I have little more to say on it than that, Rebecca.
No problem at all. Well, we'll move on to our next story of this evening, and that is that there are suspected drug deaths in Scotland. The number of suspected drug deaths during the first half of 2021 shows a small decrease of 1% on the same period last year, though the Minister for Drugs Policy has made clear that the figure of 722 remains unacceptably high. This first report covers January to June this year, after which they will show statistics for each subsequent 3-month period. The Scottish Government has committed to the publication of suspected drug death management information from Police Scotland, in addition to the annual National Statistics Report from National Records Scotland, to provide more timely release of data on drug death trends. This will also ensure everyone involved in the national mission is aware of the challenge ahead. As work continues to get more people into treatment, £2.3 million is being allocated to Health Improvement Scotland over the next 3 years to enable to support the NHS boards in developing an integrated approach to the delivery of mental health and substance use services. The new statistics show that in the first 6 months of 2021, there were 722 suspected drug deaths, 1% fewer than during the first 6 months of 2020. Males accounted for 72% of suspected drug deaths compared to 76% during the same period last year. Just over 2/3 of suspected drug deaths were of people aged between 35 and 54. There were 35 suspected drug deaths in the under 25 age group, 29% fewer than during the first 6 months of 2020. And the police divisions with the highest numbers of suspected drug deaths were Greater Glasgow with 187, Lanarkshire with 67, Edinburgh City with 64, and Tayside also with 64. So, although there has been a decrease in the number of suspected drug deaths at the beginning of this year, Peter, do you agree with the Minister for Drugs Policy that the figure of 722 is still too high?
Well, it's totally unacceptable. I mean, I had rather a lot to say in a previous programme about the whole background to drugs, and I'll only echo a part of that here. But any drug death is a tragedy. People are very reluctant to visit the fundamentals of the problem. I mean, to go back to my concept of trying to get to the essence of the argument, the first question is, why do people take drugs in the first place? Drugs are clearly damaging to them, and that's a social and psychological and medical issue. Why are people taking these drugs? Now, Nicola, and I felt for her when she had to make this defence, valid though it was, when the initial figures were being exploited by the unionist community and saying, oh, look at this, all the talk of the Scottish government, the worst drug deaths in Europe. Nicola was saying, you have to see this against a context of historical deprivation, difficult housing, a whole range of things, the limitations placed on the Scottish government by the devolution settlement. And people saying, excuses. But these are a reality. People take drugs for a reason. I grew up during the Second World War, and the drug of choice was alcohol at the time. And God knows that was tragic enough. But it didn't introduce the element of criminality that this has introduced. And the whole question of legalization of drugs is intimately bound up with two things. In legalizing drugs, are you allowing people to destroy themselves? And that goes back to my first question. Well, why are they trying to destroy themselves in the first place? Clearly, we have to remove any concept of the drug addict as being a criminal or responsible for their, in the negative sense, for their own bad behaviour and therefore not deserving of help. They need all the help they can. The reality is that there's a morality, and it's often a religious morality or it's a vague morality that infects, I use the word advisedly, the whole drug argument. People don't like druggies, and they don't like to think that they're being in any way indulged. Now, this is utter nonsense. They are victims of a tragic, perhaps a lifestyle, perhaps deprivation, perhaps mental issues beyond their capacity to cope with, which have nothing to do with their environment. So I'm hoping, against hope, that there are experts examining all these pockets of the nature of the drug argument. I'm doing what I said I wouldn't be, holding up my giant hands in front of the camera. I hope these things will be brought together in, to use a word I don't like using, but it's the only one here, a holistic approach to this. And really some radical thinking, hard radical thinking is needed. This question of drugs is not only destroying Scottish society, it's destroying the world society. It's distorting everything. I saw a 40-minute video with no commentary of the streets of Philadelphia, one of America's major cities. And it was looking like some toxic wasteland from a fantastic downbeat science fiction film. People walking doubled up in the streets, lying doubled up. And I believe that's one aspect of the spice drug. And no visible attempt to control it, to clean the streets, to help them. People sleeping in the open, sleeping against wire fences. We're headed inexorably for an awful place with drugs. And then we find that not only does it affect these matters, it affects international issues. That one of the main sources of Afghanistan's economy is the sale of drugs. It's a big, big question. It demands all the emphasis, all the expertise, and all the common human charity that can be brought to bear on it.
Yeah, no, Scotland does certainly have a disheartening legacy relating to drug-related deaths. And there's been the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, and as you've mentioned, the viewing of drug use as a criminal act and not perhaps as an illness. But now with this £2.3 million being allocated to help substance use services, do you think that this is maybe the first step in the right direction, or is it enough to make a difference, I suppose?
It doesn't sound like enough to make a difference, quite honest. It doesn't sound it to me. I mean, I know within the context of all the clamouring, competing priorities, Rebecca, it may seem like a lot of money to the man in the street. I suspect it's a drop in the bucket. I have a neighbour, a very close neighbour, who is a nurse, a male nurse. He's actually Australian, but has settled in Scotland, and he's been doing work in drug and alcohol reduction in Glasgow, and a lot of it has changed because of the pandemic. But really, the nature of this problem, because it can be anybody, it can be anybody's child, it can be anybody's partner. People are susceptible to this. Decriminalisation, on the one hand, you say, well, we can't say to people, you can walk into your local pharmacy and you say, give me a needle and a few ampules or however it comes of heroin. I'm going away to inject myself. I couldn't do that with some normal prescription drugs, so I should have been allowed to do it with that. But there has to be a far better framework than we had, a real re-examination of the whole edifice, of the grand narratives of drugs, and say we've got to revisit this. An awful old dated phrase, thinking outside the box, sure as hell needed. Or the box will be the cardboard box in the street that they die in, lying in Sucky Hall Street in the wee small hours of the morning.
Yeah, that's true. But we'll move on to our next story of this evening. And that is that Joe Biden is to propose a target of vaccinating 70% of the world in a year. Joe Biden will reportedly propose a target for 70% of the world's population to be vaccinated within the next year at a special global vaccine summit he intends to convene alongside the UN General Assembly in New York this month. The US president's target, reported by the New York Times, is in line with ambitions set jointly by the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Health Organization, which is more ambitious than current performance and the target set at the G7 meeting in Cornwall, chaired by Boris Johnson. The G7 agreed to donate 870 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines directly, with an aim to deliver at least half by the end of 2021. The West has been repeatedly accused of hoarding surplus vaccines or of moral failure by providing jabs to teenagers or a third set of vaccines to adults when large tracts of Africa remain totally unvaccinated. The 70% target is ambitious but consistent with existing targets, according to the White House. In June, the heads of the World Bank Group, IMF, WHO and World Trade Organization set a target of having 60% of the world's population vaccinated by the middle of 2022. So, Peter, is Joe Biden's target to vaccinate 70% of the world's population realistic, do you think?
Well, as I mentioned again on a previous Broadcasting Scotland programme, the fundamental statement that is always made about targeting is that it should be ambitious but realistic. If it's not ambitious enough, you may meet the target, but you won't meet the objective that the target is designed to satisfy. Bear in mind, targets are not ends in themselves. Targets are a part of a plan to achieve an objective. And the objective is to contain, reduce, and ideally eliminate the COVID virus or the effects of the COVID virus. Now, any politician can pluck targets from the air and then offer multiple excuses as to why they didn't achieve them. It's a well-known phenomenon of the human psyche, and extending it to the society and the government and global organizations, that you will rarely achieve better than the target you set. Targets are a sort of, you're placing a ceiling that you voluntarily placed on your ambitions. On the other hand, you can't take the roof off. You've got to place the ceiling somewhere where it's reachable. Now, 60% said, how can any layman judge that? People must be looking at masses of statistics, complex mathematics, and algorithm. I'll give you an example of this from a related field. There was an article, I think it was one of the Sunday supplements. You can find some oddly riveting arguments in the Sunday supplements about the kind of mathematics that is used to support our retail system of delivery of fruit to our shelves. Now, before, that was very much a matter of somebody walking about with a clipyard board and saying, oh, the shelf looks a bit empty. Now, with big container lorries, just in time, there's elaborate mathematical techniques applied to that. And in fact, it's all looking very shaky at the moment. The algorithms are hastily being revisited because of the effects of Brexit, which is disrupting the whole concept of the supply system. But that level of analysis must be applied at the top level by the people that are examining us. I mean, any fool can say, well, the only target which makes sense is the ultimate ambitious target, 100% vaccination. That could never be realistic. But they have to look hard and say, what is the impact going to be of the 30%? I'm sure they have done. What is the impact going to be of the 30% who haven't been vaccinated? Could they, or 20%, or 10% of them, or 5% of them nullify the whole thing? I mean, exponential arithmetic is a terrifying thing in many aspects of life and politics. And when you bring it to bear on the behavior of viruses, it's a horror film terrifying. When we look, this may have spread from a single stall in a marketplace selling foodstuffs of animals and creatures that we wouldn't entertain eating. And somehow it's found out to be the dominant issue in the globe with climate change at the moment. I don't know where you draw the line there, but a target doesn't necessarily mean it's the final target. It's something you cannot marshal resources to do something unless you're marshalling them against a target. And therefore, the target may be a staging post. And there are targets within targets. There are benchmarks as you come towards as the giant hands again, as you move towards the thing. So 70% of the world's population, in itself, leaving aside the coin, 70% of the world's population as a target for anything is incredibly ambitious. It stands alongside the 1969 commitment of a US president to be on the moon by the end of the year. He didn't make it in 69, but that was the target, and it was achieved. And it didn't only revolutionize the world of space flight, it revolutionized electronics, forced the development of miniaturization. Huge lessons were learned from that. So this sounds very ambitious. I hope to God it's realistic, and it will be, I hope it's monitored in the proper way, and political draft, as they used to call it, the stuff thrown out of aeroplanes in World War II to confuse the bomber. Draft should be cut out of the argument. I mean, we've had some draft in the Scottish Parliament this week on some of the key issues that we've addressed here. It makes me sick to listen to the attempt to score political points on issues like that. It really does.
Yeah, no, as you said, I mean, the target is incredibly ambitious. It exceeds that of at least 50% proposed at the G7 summit in Cornwall earlier this year. But is there perhaps slightly that Joe Biden might be trying to create a slight good news story after his disastrous Afghanistan bailout?
Well, he could be forgiven for doing that, but insofar as somebody like me can judge the Joe Bidens or the Donald Trumps of this world, if it comes to that, I don't think he's that kind of man. I really don't think. Joe Biden consistently throughout his career has done things which on any real politic judgment would have harmed his career. He's said things, he's challenged his own party, he's opposed things his own party was in favour of. To me, Joe Biden's record was of trying to do the right thing, and I have no reason to believe he's doing other than that at the moment. But that would be a natural balancing benefit, yes. And at the end of the day, since the first duty of a politician is to get elected, and the second duty is to survive before they can do anything, I can't say it would have been ruled out of consideration. I think a Joe Biden is a big enough man to have set that target, even if it had harmed his career.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, we'll move on to our next story of this evening, and that is that Norway coalition talks have started with climate and oil as the focus. Norway's Labour leader today began coalition talks with other parties of the centre-left seeking to form a government after their parliamentary election victory, with a focus on climate change and oil. Labour leader Jonas Gahr Store must address voters' concerns over global warming and a widening wealth gap, while ensuring any transition away from oil production and the jobs it creates is gradual. Store's goal is to convince both the rural-based Centre Party and the mostly urban socialist left to join him, which would give his cabinet 89 seats, 4 more than what is needed for a majority in the 169-seat assembly. There is more that unites us than divides us, Store told reporters outside his home in Oslo after speaking with other party leaders on the phone today. He must persuade Centre and the Socialists to compromise on policies ranging from oil and private ownership to non-member Norway's relations with the European Union. In particular, Store must persuade them to compromise on energy policy, including where to allow exploration while also cutting emissions. Norway produces around 4 million barrels of oil equivalent per day, accounting for over 40% of export revenues. But most major parties also believe oil will play a smaller part over time and hope that engineering know-how of oil firms can be transferred to renewable energy, including offshore wind. So, Norway is Europe's second biggest oil-producing nation after Russia and the world's third biggest natural gas exporter. So do you think that the anti-fossil fuel stance of the Greens was a game changer in ousting Norwegian Conservative Prime Minister Erna Solberg?
I don't think I'm equipped to, I don't know enough about it to analyse the internal politics that led to that. All I can say is that the Scandinavian Nordic, I'm not quite sure where the terminology starts and finishes, countries, have consistently shown a mature, in most things, adult approach to big problems like that. And they're addressing the problems that the rest of the world should be addressing right now. COP6 must address, and Scotland must address. In a sense, when we watch the behaviour of countries like Norway, Sweden and Denmark, we're having a telescope into the future to look at how an independent Scotland may have to behave, including, interestingly, in the point you made at the beginning, Rebecca, about the nature of the government and the parties, because the shape of the Scottish Parliament will be a very different one after independence. It will be much closer to what the ideals of those who constructed the devolution settlement were, maybe with some dubious motives, and that it would be in a state of eternal coalition and truly representative voting systems and constant balancing of interest groups. Because politics is about balancing and resolving conflicting views and priorities of interest groups. It's in the very nature of society and in the very nature of human beings. That's what we are, that's what we do. But huge, difficult choices are to be made. I have to say, in our own Parliament and both of our parliaments, if I can count Westminster, our Parliament in any real sense, the calibre of many of the politicians is way below that necessary to make these decisions in the proper way. I mean, there have to be sacrifices made, as we all know, because we, in our independence arguments, held up Norway as the exemplar of the country that had managed its oil revenues, was successful, had the massive oil revenue fund, it bled out into social policies and a whole range of things. And now they may have to rein back on that. I mean, a combination of this zero emissions, the impact of COVID, we're all going to have to look at a radically different lifestyle. Really, for Scotland, it is a close examination of what Norway is doing is important. And of course, we have an excellent doyen in the double end of commentators in Leslie Riddoch, who has an expert knowledge of these countries. And I'm sure Leslie will be casting her analytical and critical eye over them and learning the lessons for Scotland. And I hope the Scottish Government listens to it. But the world must look at Norway because I think we've a huge amount to learn from them. And if they get it wrong, we'll have a huge amount to learn from that too.
Yeah, that is very true. Well, we'll move on to our next story of this evening, and that is the actions to improve racial equality. A new plan will positively impact the lives of people from minority ethnic communities as part of Scotland's recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. The immediate priorities plan for race equality focuses on the roots of inequalities which disproportionately impact minority ethnic communities. The plan, which will run until 2023, includes investing in services tailored for communities. For example, mental health initiatives and associations ensuring equal participation and adequate support to progress in the workplace, continuing the rollout of the emergency sustenance funding, assisting low-income families as part of pandemic recovery. Other actions include work to ensure minority ethnic people are properly represented and included in data collected and used by public books, curriculum reform and work to diversify the teaching profession, and creation of a long-term strategy that addresses structural and organisational racism. So, Peter, Christina McKelvey, MSP, and the Minister for Equalities and Older People said in a report that it's not enough to simply not be racist, and in order to truly take down the structural and institutional inequalities that make minority ethnic people's lives worse in Scotland, we need to have an actively anti-racist approach to everything that we do. Do you agree with this sentiment?
Yeah. I mean, the racism thing is so deeply embedded in many of our most basic experiences and assumptions. I mean, even in somebody like me, I like to think that throughout my life, I've been resolutely non-racist. But I'm not immune to the kind of stereotypes that are constantly presented to me. And I've made my share of questionable jokes. I mean, I'll say that the Jenny Godley thing, I really felt for Jenny Godley. People say, well, you shouldn't have looked at it. These were awful things to say. Everything in time is said within a context. I mean, I know people, I've known people over a lifetime who are people I admire hugely. I would trust my life, family, savings, everything with. And these people in their time were part of their day and age and like me said and did things that they shouldn't. Tackling this actually starts in the schools, except that the schools, I know they do try to do things to it, but I've talked to a few teachers, and I've got teachers in my family, and I was talking to a head teacher in a significant school in Scotland very, very recently about the need to get children understanding the nature of their society, the nature of politics in the society, the nature of the rule of law, the nature of equality. And he said, you realise we're actively debarred from addressing some of these issues because they're such political hot potatoes. I do understand that, but it has to be. Let me give you an odd parallel. It may not be a significant one. Much of my racial judgment was based on the fact that I've been a lifelong lover of jazz. And jazz, unquestionably, although there have been many exponents who didn't fit this category, is a product of the American black. And it's a product of the slave trade in America and the welding together of Western influences, church influences, very Scottish elements in jazz, in the basic harmonic structures of the hymn tunes. And most of my heroes throughout my teenage, and I have to say still in my adult life, have been the great jazz musicians. The Louis Armstrongs, the Jelly Roll Mortons, the Billie Holidays, So I had a natural affinity. And this was mirrored way back in American history by a young lawyer who was brought up in a racist Southern family who went to a concert in the Deep South and Louis Armstrong played at it. And the man come out of that, and his father was an out-and-out racist, this particular lawyer, and he come out of that and saying, how has a man with such he was religious, but a God-given gift, how can he be in any way not equal to me? How can he be considered as an inferior being? And you've only got to look at the achievements of the black race in America or across the globe, in music, in the arts, in a whole range of areas. There are abundant examples of that. So I may be wandering from the core. What can I say about racism, about Black Lives Matter? It's an intolerable affront to humanity and to anybody who thinks of themselves as having any ethics, whether they're secular, democratic ethics or religious ethics, to say that this is in any way tolerable. So anything we do that makes it better is what I want to see.
Yeah, certainly. Well, we'll move on to our next story of this evening, and that is supporting children in the justice system. Transformational change is to be brought about in the way children are treated by the justice system. The Scottish Government will work to ensure that all eligible children who are victims or witnesses to abuse or violence will have access to the Bairns House by 2025. That means the service they need will be available via a coordinated approach designed to reduce the number of times children have to recount their experiences to different professionals. Children below the age of criminal responsibility whose behaviour has caused harm will also have access to the services it will provide. Justice Secretary Keith Brown was updated on the progress towards developing a national Bairns House model at the National Symposium today. This coincides with the Scottish Government publishing its vision and values to inform a longer-term programme of work. Bairns House, based on an Icelandic model, will bring together services in a 4-rooms approach with child protection, health, justice and recovery services all made available in one setting. These project developments have been supported by a number of bodies, including Children First, Healthcare Improvement Scotland and the Care Inspectorate. So, the Bairns House seems a practical and a sensible solution to what must have been a very alienating experience of being shunted around different locations and services. So do you think this is a more holistic way of dealing with witnesses and child victims, and is this a good thing?
Yes, and I mean, it's homing in on witnesses, and victims, and it ignores, for good reasons for the moment, the perpetrators. But one name came to mind in all of this, and that was Jamie Bolger, that tragic case so many years ago, and all that followed from it. And you have to say the system is really, the law, in many of its aspects, has actively compounded the damage to children rather than aided them. So this looks like a very good and significant, I won't say a starting place, it's more than a starting place. It sounds like quite a radical initiative with teeth, and I support it and I welcome it.
Yeah, certainly. Well, we'll move on to our next story of this evening, and that is the funding for child and adolescent mental health services. Funding of £10.83 million has been allocated for the remainder of this year to help improve access to child and adolescent mental health services. The investment will also increase the number of trained professionals to support children and young people with neurodevelopmental support needs. The allocation is part of the £120 million Mental Health Recovery and Renewal Fund announced in February 2021 and will help to deliver a number of improvements, including improve access to CAMHS assessments out of hours, help to put in place specialist regional CAMHS services, including those with learning disabilities and those requiring secure care, help provide access to CAMHS intensive home treatment teams, support mental health liaisons teams with paediatric services. The Recovery and Renewal Fund supports many mental health measures contained in the programme for government. Other policies include extra support for health and care staff, completion of the commitment to recruit 800 additional mental health workers this year, and a pledge that at least 10% of frontline NHS spending will go towards mental health over this Parliament. Mental Wellbeing and Social Care Minister Kevin Stewart revealed the allocation during a visit to the Young People's Inpatient Unit at the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People in Edinburgh. So, Peter, the funding allocation, £18.7 million for the Recovery and Renewal Fund, includes £5.25 million for the neurodevelopmental services. And this is especially important as some children are referred to child and adolescent mental health services but don't actually meet the mental health criteria to be treated. So do you think that this is a positive sort of getting it right for every child approach?
Short answer is yes, and really, Rebecca, I've little more than I can say about this. It's eminently a vital, important area, and these measures sound fine to me. I have no expertise. I have much practical experiences of the effect of mental illness on children, and therefore I welcome it because the present provisions are grossly inadequate. That's really all I have to say on it.
No problem. And do you think it comes at, I suppose, quite a crucial time then? Because the pandemic has severely impacted the mental health of children, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely, and there's considerable evidence that the incidence of child abuse, whether it's violence or sexual abuse, has gone up in that period. And the pressures on the parents or the carers, whatever the case may be, impinge on the children too. And too often the children are seen but not heard. And in this area, hearing children is a very difficult, professional, highly delicate task. So, yes, I agree with that.
No problem. Well, we'll move on to our last story of this evening, and that is that Channel 4 should not be sold. Culture Secretary Angus Robertson has set out the Scottish Government's strong opposition to any plans to privatise Channel 4. A letter to the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, Oliver Dowden, accompanies the Scottish Government's response to the UK Government consultation. It seeks assurances that the full impact to the output of Channel 4 services, businesses and the wider creative industries in Scotland is urgently considered. Mr Robertson says that the proposed case for privatisation is flawed. He adds, I strongly disagree with the assertion that privatisation offers the best means of ensuring its future success and sustainability as a public service broadcaster and its continued contribution to the UK's creative industries. As many as 60 UK TV production companies could face going out of business if Channel 4 is privatised, according to a report published as the government closes its public consultation into the potential sale of the broadcaster. Channel 4's unique status, established in 1982 as an editorially independent broadcaster to provide a culturally challenging alternative to BBC One, BBC Two and ITV, makes it vitally important to hundreds of independent television producers across the country. It is publicly owned but commercially funded, mostly through TV and revenue, and it is not required to turn a profit or focus on dividends for shareholders. So, Peter, to privatise Channel 4 is really to remove the soul, I suppose, of its founding ethos. So is this an acceptable outcome, do you think?
Absolutely not. I mean, there are two, I wouldn't describe them as beacons of enlightenment, but two egregiously better organs of the media in Britain today. One is The Guardian, for all its faults as a newspaper, and the other is Channel 4. Channel 4 News specifically. I can raise questions over much of Channel 4's output and its attempt to be radical culturally. And I remember its early days, there were some very odd manifestations of that. But not only that, I think this decision being pushed by this government is blatantly, openly political. They are trying to nobble a highly relatively compared to the rest of the media. You may say that's not a high benchmark to compare, but they stand well above most others, including the BBC, in terms of their objectivity of coverage. Now, they're not completely objective. Jon Snow, as an anchor man, he's very good. You've got to remember that the Snows, in all their manifestations, are part of the establishment, very much so. I mean, the historian Snow, the nephew of Jon Snow, is rooted in the British establishment. He's married into it. So if we take a Scottish independence perspective, Channel 4 is perhaps not ideally as objective as we would like it to be. But over the last decade of online activism, particularly when I was doing a lot of clipping, had regular recourse to Channel 4 as the only people who were giving any adequate reflection of what was happening on the political scene. This is an attempt to nobble them. I mean, if you look at another commercial channel, STV does some reasonable politics from time to time, and its output, it was very much a popular channel in entertainment terms. STV was never, and it's still not in any way, a significant political commentator. When you come to the Murdoch channel of Sky, well, they're a mixed bag. You know, the good guys sometimes find their way through and tell the truth to power. But we're really relying on the BBC, with all its faults and all its links to government as a public service broadcaster, Channel 4, The Guardian, to some degree, The Independent, and various very much smaller independent publications for any real window in our world. And thank God for the online movement. Although it produces barrelloads of utter crap, it also illuminates the body politic and the debate. I'm dead against this. If I had a railing to chain myself to stop it happening, I would do.
No problem. Well, that is all we have time for this evening, Peter. But thank you so much for coming on tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you and hearing all your thoughts and everything. So thanks so much.
Likewise, Rebecca.
No problem. And thanks to everyone as well watching at home. And if you would like to support Broadcasting Scotland a little bit further, then just follow the link at the bottom of your screen just now. It's the more who support us, the more programmes we can make for you. So thanks again to Peter for joining us tonight, and thanks to you watching at home. Have a good night. Yep.
I use 4 letters.